Easy access to energy has been one of the leading forces in our transformation from a localized agricultural society to a globalized, industrialized, and information-based economy. The energy sources that have powered this change have largely been coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. But each of these comes with some major drawbacks, like air and water pollution, rising global temperatures, radiation exposure, landscape degradation, and geopolitical instability. In addition, most of these energy sources are in limited and declining supply. Because of this, a great deal of effort has been expended on developing renewable energy sources that are less damaging to our environment. There are multiple candidates like geothermal, ocean tides, biomass, wind, and solar. On today's episode of A Public Health Journal, we're going to look at one of these energy sources in more depth. We're going to talk about wind energy and examine its benefits and some of the health concerns that it is raising. Please stay tuned.
Welcome to A Public Health Journal, a program that explores public health issues facing our society today and tomorrow. The host of the show is Dr. Ed Ellinger, Commissioner of Health for the state of Minnesota. A Public Health Journal is sponsored by the Minnesota Department of Health and the Hennepin County Human Services and Public Health Department, all working together towards the goal of healthy people living in healthy communities.
Welcome to A Public Health Journal. Today we're going to look at wind energy and its potential to be part of our energy future. In the discussion, you will see that wind energy does not come without its share of controversy. Surprisingly, it is a complex and controversial energy source that has passionate advocates arguing the full continuum of options, from markedly increasing its use to significantly limiting its use. In our conversation today, we will try to avoid supporting one policy position over another, but instead try to focus on what we know about production of energy from wind and also what we don't know. But before we get into that conversation, we'll start with a brief video that explains some of the basic facts about wind turbines and how they turn wind into energy.
We've all seen those creaky old windmills on farms, and although they may seem about as low-tech as you can get, those old windmills are the predecessors for new modern wind turbines that generate electricity. The same wind that used to pump water for cattle is now turning giant wind turbines to power cities and homes. Okay, have a look at this wind farm in the California desert. A hot desert next to tall mountains, an ideal place for a lot of wind. Here's another one on the windy prairies of Wyoming. Now, today's wind turbines are much more complicated machines than the old prairie windmills, but the principle is the same. Both capture the wind's energy. Okay, here's how it works. First, a wind turbine blade works sort of like an airplane wing. Blowing air passes around both sides of the blade. The shape of the blade causes the air pressure to be uneven, higher on one side of the blade and lower on the other. And that's what makes it spin. The uneven pressure causes the blades to spin around the center of the turbine. On the top, there's a weather vane that's connected to a computer to keep the turbine turned into the wind so it captures the most energy. Now, the blades are attached to a shaft, which only turns about 18 revolutions a minute, and that's not nearly fast enough to generate electricity by itself. So, the rotor shaft spins a series of gears that increase the rotation up to about 1,800 revolutions per minute. And at that speed, the generator can produce a lot of electricity. So, why are wind turbines so tall? Well, the higher up you go, the windier it is. More wind naturally means more electricity. And in many cases, larger turbines can also capture wind energy more efficiently. The blades can sweep a circle in the sky as long as a football field. Now, what's really cool is that even a small wind farm, like this one in Wyoming, can generate enough electricity to power more than 9,000 homes. And larger farms can provide much more clean energy for our homes and businesses.
We are now joined by Dr. Carl Herbrandson, a toxicologist with the Minnesota Department of Health in the Site Assessment and Consultation Unit in the Environmental Health Division. Carl is involved in evaluating potential health impacts from environmental exposure. Carl has a PhD in toxicology from the University of Minnesota and is co-author with Dr. Rita Messing of a report on the public health impacts of wind turbines, which won a notable document award from the National Conference of State Legislatures. Carl, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
And I think most people would be sort of surprised that the health department is engaged in wind turbines. Why were you involved in this?
I mean, we're a little surprised ourselves, but there really isn't any group that can deal with the issue of looking at health questions about exposure to things like wind turbines. And that's where the issue came up. There were some questions about the potential impacts on health from wind turbines. And so we were asked to take a look at it, partially because we deal with sites with different locations where there are multiple exposures and where you're concerned not just about a single chemical exposure, but you're concerned about other things, cumulative exposures and cumulative impacts. And so since we have some experience in looking at those things, we were approached to look at this issue.
So if people look at turbines, you got wind and you've got noise and you've got just the visibility things, the flicker. So those things can have a health impact, right?
Well, there are some studies that have shown association of the noise from wind turbines being associated with things like sleeplessness and headaches and stress. And so it is something that, it really does appear to happen. I mean, just like living beside a road, if you have, or living under an airport, you certainly have, a lot of exposure to a lot of noise. And so it is possible that there can be health impacts from exposure to noise.
So before we get into those, sort of the health topics, let's talk a little bit about wind. I have a map here just of wind of the state of Minnesota, which shows where the wind is, and it shows that the brighter the colors, there's more of the wind. So where's the best wind sources in Minnesota?
Well, it's out in the prairie land and also in the farmland in the southern part of the state and the western part of the state, southwestern Minnesota. Buffalo Ridge area, why there's a wind farm out there. You can see from this is the average wind speed in Minnesota, annual average wind speed, and you can see that the wind speeds actually on an annual average are quite high out there.
So Minnesota is a good source of wind?
It is a very good source out in southwestern Minnesota and southern Minnesota. Yes.
So is Minnesota one of the top wind-producing states that produces wind energy?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. When I first got involved in wind turbines with this issue, which was back in 2009, we were, I believe, number 4 in the country in terms of states, in terms of wind turbines.
So why are people thinking about wind turbines? What's the reason?
Well, they convert wind into energy, into the wind energy. There's energy obviously in the wind, and they convert that into electricity. And if you can get that electricity then onto the grid, you can supply a fair amount of electricity to cities and towns.
And you can offset the use of coal and gas, all of the things that also have health impacts.
Yes, yes, because there are health impacts from every source of electricity, including nuclear and coal.
Right.
As well.
So we're trying to find the most beneficial, both to generating energy and also protecting the environment and protecting health.
Yes.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specifics of what generates it, but first we need to take a little break.
Okay.
We'll be back right after this message. Welcome back. We're talking about the health impacts of wind turbines with Dr. Carl Herbrandson, a toxicologist from the Minnesota Department of Health. Carl, let's go through some of the things that actually create the issues in wind turbines, the noise and the flicker and those kinds of things. And so we've got a little graphic here that shows sort of the blades and the stem coming up. To kind of walk us through what is it that we're concerned about with wind turbines?
Well, first of all, these towers are extremely tall. They're about a football field in length. And then the blades themselves are, a half a football field in length. And so we're talking extremely large structures, and they get high up into the air, and the wind up, the higher you go, can be stronger. And so that's why they want, the people who manufacture these want them to be way up as high as possible. The problem is that when you get close to the ground, one of the problems is that when you get closer to the ground, things like trees and houses and hills slow down the wind, and so you can end up with shear. And so in this diagram, I've shown where you could have shear between a wind speed of, say, 20 miles an hour up on top and 10 miles an hour down below. So as the blade passes through the transition zone in that area of shear, the blade is tuned to so that it gets maximum power probably in one of these regions or in the average of these two regions. And so when it passes through this region where it goes from one to the other, there can be a larger noise. And so that's one of the complaints about some of these turbines. Not all of them, only some are susceptible to shear. The biggest thing that I think that you have is that wind turbines themselves, as the blades pass through the wind, they make some noise, and it's a broad frequency. It's many frequencies, from low frequency through high frequency.
Is there also noise from the mechanics itself, just
there
the
is
gears?
Some, but they're a lot better with that. Now that has really actually been suppressed a large amount, so that now the biggest noise is typically aerodynamic noise. And so it has to do with how much noise the blade has when it passes through the wind.
All right, and we'll get to also how far you are from the noise.
And that's going to matter too. If you consider that these blades, the tip of the blade is traveling at about 140 miles an hour, 140, 150 miles an hour. That's pretty fast. and so going through the wind or going through the air at that speed, it's making some noise. Right. And so if you're close to the turbine, the blade, as it passes by you, is creating a large amount of noise, and then when it's a football field or so away from you, it's making a lot less noise.
So the noise is not constant.
So
it's sort of
not
up
a
and down.
constant. There's a rhythmic.
All right. And what about the visual impact? It creates a shadow, and these blades are going around and causing shadow and flicker. I understand is also a concern that people have.
That's pretty easy to model, though. And that's something that we believe that should be modeled in every circumstance, so that you never have, a turbine set up so that the shadow can fall on someone's home. You can model that and you can shift it because it's going to be in something that's going to be east or west of you during sunset, basically, or sunrise.
So that can be managed and where these are sited, but the sounds are the major problem, it sounds like. So let's take a look at this next chart that we have here, which really shows the decibels, the intensity of the sound, and then sort of the annoyance. So maybe you can walk through what this chart is showing.
Well, this is basically showing that when you have aircraft flying overhead, that you have complaints. You have complaints from people when it gets out to say above 50 decibels, it starts to increase, and that's 70 decibels. You can see on this chart why about 40% of people are going to be highly annoyed by the sound. And road traffic and railroads, similarly, they start at about the same place, and then they increase slowly. With wind turbines, it appears that it starts a lot lower, so you need much less noise to have more complaints about wind turbines.
Okay. So the intensity of the noise seems to be lower intensity people are bugged by it with wind turbines more than they are with
Right, so it's not just loudness, it's not just intensity of the noise that's bothering people. There is something else here, and it's probably Most of it is the rhythmic thump, the rhythmic part of the noise. It's not a thumping unless there's shear, but the rhythmic part of the noise.
Right. And is it, what's the frequency of the noise? There's high frequency and low frequency, and does that play into the equation of how annoying the noise is?
It certainly seems to. We have, the turbines themselves are broad spectrum. They give off noise at high frequencies and at low frequencies. But the part that actually travels through the air for the greatest distances, just because of the nature of the waves, is the low frequency noise. The other thing about wind turbines is it's a modulated noise. So you can have, if it has something to do with the rotation, it's going to be, or with every blade as it passes you, it's going to be 1 a second basically. So it's going to have 1 hertz is going to be the frequency. It's going to be right around one per second, because it takes about 3 seconds for the entire blade to travel around once, and typically there are 3 blades. Mm-hmm. And so there will be some modulation of the broad frequency noise, and that modulation will occur on a periodicity of about 1 second.
Can you insulate against noise in different ways? I mean, does low frequency noise get into places that high frequency noise doesn't?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, that's one of the big issues. It's relatively easy to insulate for higher frequencies. But the low frequency can penetrate through walls. And it has to do with the wavelength of the noise itself in air, and also with the thickness of the wall and what's inside the wall and the medium that it has to pass through when it goes through the wall.
All right, so sometimes if you're in a house, you'd be affected by the low frequency noise and not as much by high frequency noise.
You'd hear it.
Yeah.
You'd probably hear the low frequency better than you'd hear the high frequency.
And how about distance? Is there an attenuation of noise, high frequency noise, more quickly than low frequency noise?
Certainly. It falls off much quicker. But our low frequency noise sensitivity, though, is also quite a bit less than our high frequency noise sensitivity. Your ears, we don't do a good job of hearing that low organ note, that you have down there, that really low hum. But we can hear the higher notes much better.
I know as you get older, you lose your high frequency hearing. Do you lose your low frequency hearing?
I don't know that. You got me.
So maybe the older you are, the more you're going to be impacted
Right.
by the wind turbines. All right, I want to talk about in the last segment the health impacts, the things that people are bringing up that we need to be concerned about. But first, we need to take one more little break. We'll be back right after this message.
Wind energy works. A renewable energy source, wind provides clean, emission-free energy, and gathering it is environmentally friendly. Unlike fossil fuels, wind is abundant and inexhaustible. The wind is there. We just need to use it. Visit our website today to find out how you can make this a reality.
Welcome back. We're talking about the health impact of wind turbines with Dr. Carl Herbrandson from the Minnesota Department of Health. Carl, what are the complaints that people bring forward? What are the health issues that we should be concerned about and we should be thinking about with wind turbines?
There are general complaints like sleeplessness and headache and stress. Those are the primary ones, and those do appear to correlate with noise above 35 decibels. So as you increase the noise, you increase the complaints for those. There's also vestibular vibration has been also suggested as a possible source of health problems.
So that's sort of the inner ear.
That's the inner ear. That's what's involved in your balance. That's what's involved, when you get seasick, when you get car sick. It's because of the unbalancedness in your vestibular system. Mm-hmm. It gets a little bit out of whack. And typically it's the combination of that and visual signals. And
yeah. So you did this report in 2009. Have there been more information since that time? Because yours was a fairly general overview of the potential health impacts. Is there more information coming out about the health impacts of wind turbines?
We haven't been involved very much. upfront, we haven't been involved in very much since 2009. However, the main thing that I think that has happened since then is that people have figured out how better to measure noise. Measuring noise is extremely difficult when you're dealing with low frequencies and vibration. Because you have, if you just think of the microphone buffeting in the air, it makes it very difficult to use a microphone. There are other issues related to it, like rustling of leaves, traffic, noise from farms, noise from all kinds of things. How do they filter that out? And they're doing a better job of figuring out how to do that when they're testing noise. In terms of the health impacts themselves, there is an understanding that a lot of these can be dealt with by lowering the audible noise, by increasing the distance of setbacks, by increasing the participation rate of the people that are in the area. So there is some benefit associated with it for the people in the local area.
Who makes the decisions about siting for wind turbines and distances, and how is that decided?
I think the proposals are primarily done by companies or cooperatives. And then the State Department of Commerce, the Energy Security Division, I believe, is involved in the licensing of that. And the Public Utilities Commission also has to approve.
Do communities get engaged in deciding of where these are and how they get sited and ownership of them? And I would assume the more people are engaged in making decisions about it, the less controversial these would be.
The more people that are involved in it, probably the better solution that they appear to come to. However, there are cases where, in a lot of instances, not a lot, in some instances, why you do have controversy in a community between should we have it, shouldn't we have it, and that obviously that can spread to anger and stress, and that can make it so that the communities can suffer. On the other hand, in some communities, why there is acceptance by the community, and there is a sharing of the benefits from the turbines.
So, this is a question you probably can't answer, but, it just raises the question in my mind, how do you balance those risks and benefits? Because there certainly are environmental benefits for wind turbines. You don't have carbon dioxide going into the air, you don't have air pollution, but you do have the noise and the vibrations, and you have economic development, and yet you have the stress. How do you, on a health, you're a toxicologist, how do you maximize the benefits and lower the risks in these kinds of things?
What we've been doing is basically just trying to get out the facts as we see them. We try to figure out what are the exposures, what are the what appears to indicate that there will be a problem, what appears to indicate that there will be annoyance. And then the planners of this and the communities have to make those types of decisions. And it appears that if you have larger setbacks for people who are non-participants, that you are going to get more acceptance in communities.
Is the federal government engaged in this at all? Are there some national studies, the Centers for Disease Control or National Occupational and Safety and Health, or any agency, Environmental Protection Agency?
I haven't seen studies by any of them. There's been a fair amount of work done by states and by local governments. They're the ones that are generally getting hit because noise is generally considered to be a local issue. It's considered to be, because of the fact that locals can decide better what the benefits are to their community and what the risks are to their community.
Yeah, noise has always been looked at as sort of a nuisance.
Right,
and
exactly.
So which is local ordinances and those kinds of things.
It's
but
like,
they don't have I would suspect, this is a fairly complex thing about, noise and decibels and frequencies, and how do they get that kind of information to make those kinds of decisions?
Well, that's where we try to provide that information. It's similar to odors. It's the exact same type of thing where it is a local decision that has to be made.
So do you see public health agencies at the local level or at the state level getting more engaged in these as we push harder and harder for more renewable energy sources? Is this a model that we should be looking at?
Probably as a resource we will be pushed more and more to provide information. However, to make the decision, that's very difficult for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think public health really is there to collect the information. So what studies do you think need to be done to help the locals make this kind of decision, or, and who should get engaged in making those kinds of studies?
Well, I think noise studies are the important thing, so that we can actually come up with ways of measuring noise, first of all, that we can all accept as being good ways of measuring them. I also think that the modeling for the noise put out by the wind turbine farms has to be, they have to be better modeled, and they have to provide more information for the residents about what the actual exposures could be.
Yeah. Is there any thought about how large these farms are, and how small? Does that make a difference in noise?
I don't think so because they're generally way out in the country, mm-hmm. and so therefore the size of the farm, you're exposing different people. It's not like you're exposing more people to them. Certainly, if you put 4 wind turbines near a single residence, that's going to have more of an impact than 1 wind turbine near that residence. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, by making a farm larger, you're making it larger on an aerial basis, mm-hmm. not by compacting more into that area.
Yeah, okay. Well, we just, obviously this is a complex subject, mm-hmm. with a lot of things that are unknown, so that this is a good sort of introduction. And I hope several years from now we come back and we'll have many more answers about the health impacts of wind turbines. So Carl, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And I'll be back with a closing comment right after this message. May you live in interesting times. That's an oft-used phrase that is both a blessing and a curse. It is a phrase that is apropos for our time because almost everything in today's very interesting world contains elements of blessing and curse, good and bad, benefit and risk, opportunity and danger. What adds even more interest to our times is that what is good and what is bad is often a matter of debate and opinion. One's perspective on any issue is based on one's history, values, self-interest, and worldview. Often in today's discussions, we see that what's right for one is wrong for another, or one person's floor is another person's ceiling. Those differences of opinions are part of the human condition, and they will complicate and enrich our lives forever. To effectively deal with those differences of opinion and not be paralyzed, we need venues where those differences can be debated in a respectful way, where everyone is allowed to speak and be heard. And we also need a space where facts can be differentiated from opinions. This is where public health can play a role. One of the roles of public health is to collect data or information to objectively define the problem. Certainly public health workers have opinions and should voice those along with everybody else. But their first job is to present solid and trusted information, clearly separated from opinions, that can be used as the basis for the needed conversations. As Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, "You are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." When the health of the public is at stake, public health's primary role is to collect and present those facts so that the debate around those opinions can begin. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you can join us again next time on A Public Health Journal.